Hey everyone, this is Miss Saunders here. This is the week one lecture. This is kind of to accompany the readings for week one, and some of the other media and the other content. I just want to add before we get started. The book whose excerpt you read for the reading this week was written in 1965. The book is called Writing for Business, as you already know. And I just wanted to explain before we go into some of the concepts that we're using, we're going to be reading some other excerpts, some other chapters from this book throughout the semester. And I just wanted to add what some of you might have already noticed is that this book is dated. It was published in 1965. So although there are some really good writing advice, right, and a lot of things that I think we can learn about professional writing from this text, it's worth noting that some of the references to technology are a little bit outdated. The other book that we'll be reading is more contemporary in that sense, but I think that this book provides a lot of timeless wisdom about professional writing. So that's why we're going to look at some of these ideas in a little bit more detail. Okay, so let's think about this idea briefly of business-like writing. So it's defined as writing that focuses on the dual objective of profit and goodwill, and it's achieved by the means of writer's craft. That seems pretty easy to understand. The dual objective of profit and goodwill, and by goodwill, I kind of think as the basic, courtesy and fundamental expression of kindness that you kind of is the professional expectation in professional writing. Of course, by profit, that's important to kind of note that whenever you're thinking about writing professionally, you're always doing so ultimately to make a profit. So I think in terms of establishing a connection to the people to whom you're writing, it's always important to think about expressing a certain amount of courtesy and goodwill when you're writing. So that's kind of a basic kind of fundamental ideas of what professional writing means and how do we achieve it. It's achieved by the means of writer's craft, and by craft we kind of define as the conscious choices you're making as a writer while you're creating your sentences, choosing your words, forming paragraphs, etc. Okay, so let's think about this quote from Winston Churchill, which this chapter talks about Winston Churchill and his kind of career as a writer and his use of language with some frequency. So Churchill said, "The man who could not say what he had to say in good English could not have had very much to say that was worth listening to at all." So I think this is important to kind of pause on because it's worth noting that whatever the message is, whatever you're trying to express with language, with the written word, if you don't express it um, in good English, right, then no one's going to listen to it or it's not worth hearing, right? So here I kind of think of, he's putting the emphasis on the writer's form or the writer's craft as the vehicle by which you express yourself. And of course, in the professional writing class, we're thinking about expressing ourselves in professional situations and on professional terms. Okay, so what is Churchill's good English? What does he mean when he says good English or writers, when we think about this idea of writer's craft, how can we think about that specifically for professional writing? So Churchill's good English is writing that has accuracy, writing that is brief or uses brevity, and writing that has the right emotional tone. So in case any of you don't know, brevity kind of means to say something brief and concisely, right? To say as much as you can and as little words as possible. All right, so let's dive straight into this idea of accuracy. What does Churchill mean by being right or being accurate with your words? So to write accurately, I think you must often read because the more words you encounter, the better you will be able to accurately express yourself. Now, I've put that word in quotation marks because I think accuracy in writing is a fool's sport. And what I mean by that is you'll find the more that you write, the more that you are trying to express yourself, you'll notice that oftentimes you are failing to express exactly what you want to say with words, because words are kind of, if you look at linguistics, they're kind of like a faulty mode of expression. each word basically points to another word, which points to another word. It very rarely points to the thing itself. Now, I'm getting kind of abstract, but I think the point to take from this is that the more that you read and the more that you become familiar with the form of writing, which is kind of, I think, separate from the act of expression, because I think expression is always at least a little bit of a failure, the better that you will be able to accurately express yourself. So accuracy in writing requires a command of vocabulary and sentence construction. So I kind of like to compare, I hope that throughout this course, you will begin to form a bit of a writer's toolbox in your head. And I like to compare it to a Scrabble bag. When you play the game of Scrabble, there are a bunch of letters and you pull them out. I like to think of like the writer's toolbox, which you begin to form in your head by reading and noticing the way that words are put together and that words are used. You begin to have that bag of phrases and tools in your head, and you can pull them out as you are writing. And the more that you do that, the better that you will be able to strive for this idea of accuracy, which means choosing the right word at the exact right time. So accuracy requires care and intention. You must imagine you are in control of a million tiny decisions in terms of the sentence style, word choice, and paragraph construction. So, basically, you might not be aware of it currently. I know I certainly wasn't when I first started writing. But there are a million tiny decisions to make in terms of word choice, in terms of how you're shaping your sentences. And the more aware you are of each tiny decision, the better that your writing will be as a whole. I cannot stress that enough. So the basic idea is if you want to write more accurately, then you need to write and read. And you need to pay attention when you read to the way that things are shaped and the way that things are put together. So, in terms of thinking about Winston Churchill and how he used language, because I think he's an example of someone who used language really effectively through history. So he used to exercise constant vigilance to ensure clarity and comprehension on the part of the reader. It is so I like to think of it as kind of like a tunnel. As a writer, you write something and you kind of put it through the tunnel, I guess the comprehension tunnel, you could call it, and the reader perceives it at the other end. Now, the more that you write and the more experience you have as a writer, the better you'll be able to understand how the reader perceives something. So you'll be able to become familiar with both sides of the tunnel, so to speak. And once you are aware of how the reader is perceiving your language on the other end, the better you are able to ensure clarity in your writing process, in your revision process, and in your editing process. But I just want to, say that writing is definitely a continuum. It's a spectrum. And basically, throughout this course, we just want to become closer to being right, closer to being accurate, closer to perfection. But as someone who's been writing every day for 9 years, I can tell you that I get better every day, and I'm never done, being perfect. Okay, so let's go to this next tenet of Churchill's good English, which is being brief, which means writing with care and intention, and it means brevity basically means writing for concision, so writing concisely, and I think that means being extremely selective with how you choose to express yourself, because you're wanting to say as much as you can in as little words as possible. So, again, writing for brevity means paying attention to the construction of your sentences and paragraphs. And I think another point to consider about writing briefly is, as a writer, it requires you to think carefully before writing. Because if you're kind of doing the writing process where you decide to word vomit all your ideas out on the page, so to speak, it might be hard to think about crafting those words concisely if you're kind of just the ideas are just gestating as they come out, as opposed to kind of taking a lot of time to think and construct all your ideas in your head. Then by the time you start to write, all you have to think about is saying it in one sentence, right? Whereas if you kind of immediately start writing, you might have to say it in 3 sentences and then condense it down to 1 sentence. Now, if you're not the type of person who likes to think things over before you begin to write, that's fine. You'll just have to think about being brief as you revise, right? So I think usually, even if you do a lot of thought before you begin to write, you're still going to have to revise, because usually I find when I'm trying to say something really concisely, I usually say something in more words the second time or the first time, and then the second time I write, I figure out how to say it in less. So with time, you'll learn how to strip down the language that you use to deliver the message of what is essential in the message, right? And that's it, no more. Okay, so the last tenet of Churchill's good English is using the right emotional tone. And I think, as we talked about, business writing is a mixture of goodwill and profit. I think the right emotional tone is something that's particularly important in professional writing because you're often communicating with other living, breathing professionals. Um, and I think the right emotional tone, we'll practice it in the class. It's, like everything else as a writer, it's kind of you learn by making mistakes. And I think the author of the text that we read this week makes an important distinction between confidence and arrogance. And she says it's often a matter of courtesy and restraint. So courtesy, kind of expressing a general sense of appreciation and value of the reader. And restraint, I think that means by not using hyperbole when talking about your own accomplishments. And by hyperbole, I kind of mean over exaggerating. So kind of, state what you're good at, but don't blow it up, right? It's a fine line to walk. And it takes a little bit of practice, but courtesy and restraint are definitely two things to keep in mind as you're creating content, particularly when you think about, cover letters and professional bios, etc. And this is something we'll talk about in later weeks, but in terms of, this idea of restraint, I think it's also important to kind of think about the value of silence in your writing and how sometimes the facts can speak volumes as opposed to like an exaggerated statement. And that's something we'll talk about in week 2, but something I just wanted to briefly mention. Okay, so the chapter this week also talks about getting the feel. So often achieving excellence in language is learning how to slant your craft towards your intended audience appropriately. This often means being very specific. So the book talks about, and I think this is important, so I wanted to mention it, mentions Churchill protest against a young officer who referred to soldiers as bodies, this is during World War II, which implied that these soldiers were already corpses. So I think by having a sensitivity to that use of diction or word choice, it shows how Churchill had a sensitivity to the emotional impact of words, which is relevant to the writing skills we use as professionals. And I think words must be selected with care and arranged for the utmost and appropriate impact upon their readers. Of course, you always want to be thinking about this idea of how is the reader perceiving this. I know I'm feeling a certain way and I'm trying to express something a certain way, but how is the reader interpreting this expression? And is this my desired impact? You might write things that you think are written very prettily or very well, but you might realize that they're not exactly the right message for your intended reader. In that case, you'll have to do what Ernest Hemingway suggested, which is kill all your darlings. And by that he means in the editing process, strip out things that you think are good in themselves because you need to create something even better. So don't be afraid to kind of kill your darlings. That's his general advice, and I think it's something that I still think about often, in my writing life. Okay, so Churchill's sentence patterns. So Churchill demonstrated virtuosity by altering his style towards his purpose. And one thing that she mentions is that he has variety in his sentences. This is something important for young writers to think about, is not constructing and shaping every sentence the same. The more variety that you have, the more that you are displaying your skill with language to your reader. And in terms of increasing profit, I think that's definitely important. It also demonstrates a certain intellectual competency. So you want to think about making sentences that are long and putting them next to sentences that are short, sentences that are structured using different, punctuation, semicolon, dash, em dash, commas, using clauses in different ways, compound sentences, simple sentences, all good to have a collage of style. And then I wanted to go into a quote from a corporation. So this quote says, the most communicative words convey feeling as well as fact, and the writer who feels keenly shapes words according to his time and place. And I thought this was really interesting, um, especially as we think about, Churchill, who is definitely shaping his sentences, thinking about the difference of bodies versus soldiers, according to his situation, right? And I completely agree with this sentence when it talks about the most communicative words convey feeling as well as fact. So as we think about, altering your style towards your purpose, and we think about how Churchill altered his style towards his purpose, we can think about, the form, that is the pacing of the sentences, whether they are short or long, and the structuring of the sentences against other sentence structures, as well as the pattern of the sounds and the juxtaposition of words and sounds against each other. These elements of language convey emotion, right? And just kind of to give you an example of how the form that you're using inflects the message that you're saying, we'll look at this sentence, which they mentioned in the book. So this is, three sentences from Churchill, used to deliver a message during World War II. So it says, I have some news for the House. It is good news. The Royal Navy has struck a crippling blow at the Italian fleet. Okay, so in the book it talks about how this is a staccato message. So staccato refers to the sound patterns in which each syllable is separate from the other. So we see, hello, I'm delivering a lecture in here. That's okay. Sorry, everyone, had a brief interruption, but we won't let that interfere. Okay, so the staccato message, yes. So, okay, so the first sentence, we see, I have some news for the House. We see each word in that sentence is constructed of a single syllable. The same goes for the second sentence. It is good news. The author mentions how the pacing of these sentences, how the first two sentences, well, they're all short, but the first two sentences are extra short, and how the tone of the writing is declarative, which I think means it directly or almost confidently states a fact. So I just wanted to point out how, additionally, how we see these three elements, the pacing, tone, sound, four elements, I'm sorry, the pacing, tone, sound, and rhythm of these sentences coming together to form an emotional impact, which inflects the literal meaning of the words. If we look at the last sentence, we see words with two syllables begin to be used. Royal Navy, crippling, Italian. So we see this sentence kind of have an extra emphasis because it's juxtaposed against two shorter sentences which only have words with a single syllable. So we see that there's a more of an impact arriving on that third sentence, right? And that's if you think about the relationship between content and form, that's when the important news is actually delivered. And we see that kind of echoed by the kind of sonic emphasis that's happening in that sentence too. So we see that Churchill's command of language makes his writing more beautiful, but it is only, and more meaningful, because it inflects the message, the form, but it is only effective because he uses all these elements successfully and executes them as fitting for his purpose in writing. So I don't want that to be, too intimidating, because we're not going to expect, or I'm not going to expect you to be thinking about language that specifically with every single sentence you write. But I think it does a good job pointing out how the form that you use is inseparable from the message. The form that you use to express yourself is inseparable from what you're saying. And that's why Churchill said it's so important to express yourself in good English. Okay, so just the book also talks about, makes a more broad connection between content and form when it says Churchill used a clipped cut-off style later in his life. And the author of the chapter that we read, Mary C. Brumage, talks about how the style was matched, his clipped cut-off style was matched for the need of action during the mid-20th century, which was around the time of and the time preceding World War II. So he used a short, direct style when the need for action was great. So again, drawing that comparison between content and form. So again, if this has been, looking at language in such a specific and intense way, I just wanted to remind you that writing is a continuum and it becomes easier with practice. And, the more that you read and write, you will never stop improving. So it's endless. I hope that I hope that sounds positive and not negative or overwhelming. So the book, just going to the next idea, the book talks about how when you get a request to write something in a professional setting, you are going to proceed step by step. And I wanted to kind of go over some of the steps that I think that are important and that are of note. So step 2, which is limiting the subject, and she says kind of in so many words, that means doing your work. And I completely agree. I think defining the subject means you understand what is wanted from your audience. And I think this goes beyond what the request is, but what is the essential task required by the request. And once you have the understanding of that, then you can really limit what you're saying and also think about the best way that you want to say it, because you are only kind of expressing what is the essential task. Also, settling the purpose, step 3, it means considering the reader as well as the material that will go in the message. And I think, these first 3 steps, these are all part of like the pre-writing phase that I mentioned, kind of this idea of thinking things through before you even begin writing. So the time that you actually are putting words to the page, you have already shaped the content significantly in your mind. So organizing the sequence, she describes it as largely, at least initially, an intuitive process, means having a beginning, middle, and end. Much can be accomplished in solitary thought, as I've said. Giving yourself time to think is essential, and an outline, making an outline first provides a natural guide for you to follow, but feel free to shift the sequence of sections as you revise, and also as you write and take some time and look at it again. You're going to see new connections between the material, new associations, and it might occur to you to make a new entry point. So while an outline is a good place to start, don't be afraid to kind of change things up as you go. She describes, the author of the textbook chapter describes drafting as this kind of getting it all down on one page initially. So I kind of agree. I think it's good to write an entire first draft in one sitting. And I think when drafting, it's a good opportunity to look at the organization of what you're writing in more detail. And that's the time when you want to start really specifically thinking about your language and how they are appropriate for your situation. Of course, you always want to think about being brief, and using the right emotional tone. Insofar as revising, I typically think about hard rules when it comes to writing. As I agree with the author that the rules change with generations, and everything is always conditional on the context of what you're writing and the situation that you're writing in. But I think the author does a good job here illustrating in the textbook how rules against things, like for instance, she uses split infinitives as an example, aren't always true 100% of the time. The questions that she asks to ask yourself: am I making myself clear? Am I being concise? Am I watching accuracy? These are all great questions to think about as you're writing. And again, I think they just kind of cement this idea of thinking about everything that you write. It almost goes through a tunnel, and the better understanding that you can have of how the writer is perceiving what you're saying, as you're either before you write, during when you're writing, or after you write, the more successful you're going to be. So it's just kind of awareness to have. And in this class, we are going to be doing a fair amount of peer review. So you're going to have people giving you actual live feedback on your drafts, which may give you some idea of how people are doing your work as well. So she talks about John Hersey's report on Hiroshima. If you're interested in reading it, this is available. I believe the whole book is available online. It was published by the New Yorker. And this was written in 1946, so the time following when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. But I think it's interesting to think about what she finds that was successful about this piece of writing. And she says it was the presentation of the data, the organization, the choice of language, clarity, and consideration of readers' interests. And these are all important things that we can think about in our professional writing, right? So I think she really emphasizes Hersey's relationship between content and form, the meticulous arrangement of material and conscious choices in crafting. They all demonstrate how writing is a process of making decisions and how and kind of give some, things to think about as you present and craft your text. Ideally, this class will help you expand your writer's toolbox when it comes to crafting text for professional settings. And one thing that I just wanted to kind of briefly mention is this idea of, at least when you're starting out, to just strive for simplicity um, in terms of the language that you're using, because I think if you think about using language simply, that means that typically everyone will understand it. If in your field you are communicating with someone who has the same level of professional expertise, then it might be appropriate to use jargon, right? So language that's specific to whatever profession you're in. But most of the time, I think you want to think about describing what you're doing in simple words that many readers can understand. And that is surprisingly difficult once you start, but it's a good goal to aim for. So just in conclusion, I wanted to expound a little bit on the author's idea of the iceberg. So she kind of compares, this act of writing to an iceberg. And as we know, icebergs are usually 90% of the iceberg is underwater and 10% of the iceberg roughly is visible. So she says that the sequence and the wording are the part that is visible. So the words that you choose and how you arrange them, that's the part that the reader sees and interprets. But the situation that gives rise to the writer's text is invisible. However, I think what she's trying to emphasize here is not only is the iceberg connected, so you cannot separate the situation that gives rise to the text from the sequence and wording, but also that the situation should be heavily considered when choosing and creating the wordings and sequences. All right, everyone. Well, that's the end of the week 1 lecture. I hope this was helpful for you.